Okay, so welcome everyone. Today is April the 14th, and it is all exactly 130 years since Dr. B.R. Ambedkar was born. And it is so, therefore, this is Ambedkar Jayanti. And today I am going to speak with Professor Aishwary Kumar, who is currently the Professorial Fellow at Stanford University. And he's the author of this incredible and amazing book called Radical Equality, which I have reviewed for The Wire. You can find the review online. And today I would want to speak to Professor Kumar about not just Ambedkar as a figure of India's past, but also as a figure of India's future. And not just India's future, but also as someone who can give us direction for a future political understanding, not just for India, but also for the world as such. Because unlike other figures of the early 20th century from India, who of course are great and important, like M.K. Gandhi, Nehru, Tagore. Dr. B.R. Ambedkar has not received that kind of, you can say, uh, adulation or response as a modern political thinker. And this is something that I feel Professor Kumar brings out through his work, which has started from his book that was published in 2015. And today I would like to speak with Professor Kumar and let me ask him and let him tell us what makes Dr. Ambedkar one of the most important political thinkers, not just from like of India, but also of the world, and what allows him to be one of the most important persons, most important intellectual figures for the future of political thought. So, Professor Kumar, you wrote this amazing book that I have reviewed. Now,
Thank you.
what would you uh, say about Dr. Ambedkar, not just as someone of the past, as a historian, but also someone who holds a lot of promise for the kind of political future for all of us?
Yeah, thank you, Huzaifa. That is a very generous description and introduction to my work. Um, there are two reasons that I think that spring up in my mind about the most interesting element in your question about the relevance uh, for uh, for the future that Ambedkar holds, and part of part of the reason of that very powerful relevance is the idea Ambedkar develops around questions of democratic rights, ideas around democratic resistance, and most importantly, the ideas around democratic citizenship. And it's often easy to conflate these things, easy to conflate rights, resistance, and citizenship. But Ambedkar actually walks that very thin line and makes possible a certain kind of distinction that we now see unfolding in front of us. There are very few political thinkers in the modern tradition, at least in the 20th century, and especially in the global South, who developed the idea of the political majority so powerfully as Ambedkar. Now, think about the moment that Ambedkar is writing in the 1940s. This is a very important decade for the very future of democracy, if not humanity itself. And it is in that decade that some of the most important works, one thinks here of Hannah Arendt's Origins of Totalitarianism, for example. One thinks here of Ambedkar's Thoughts on Pakistan, for example. Works that finally begin to grapple with a global reality, the fact of statelessness, the fact of vast swaths of humanity that are protected by an abstract notion of human rights, which actually have no value if the nation state itself turns against these populations. The notion of statelessness becomes extremely important as both a a political fact and as a conceptual peril, so to speak, because we are in the political tradition not at this point. We don't have that inventory of concepts and ideas to think about statelessness as such. This is not to say that this was already not thought about. This is to say that there is something decisive in that decade, in the 40s, when Ambedkar and others are writing, where the question of minorities becomes a global issue. With decolonization around the corner, new nation states emerging. Ambedkar, I find singular in that he combines the problem of statelessness of minorities with the question of democratic citizenship itself, not because minorities do not have a place in liberal democracy, but because he believes that there is something more to the risk, there is something more to the peril that democracy is staring at than simply the fact of statelessness. And that other dimension of democratic risk is the problem of the majority. If you read some of these, and you have done your own work on this, if we read some of these texts of the period, there's very little focus on what the majority itself is. There's a lot of attention on the minority, but there is very little on what the majority is. Think of Hannah Arendt's 1963 work on revolution, where she describes the principle of the majority decision as the founding idea of democracy, of revolutionary democracy even. So that's something that Ambedkar cannot give up, because you cannot have the tyranny of the minority either, which we now see in the United States snowballing into a real crisis for American democracy. So where is this fragile line between the rights of the minorities and the tyranny of the majority? That's the area that Ambedkar is conceptually clearing in order to understand what democracy can be, but more importantly for us today, what democracy has the power to become. The principle of majority decision can very quickly, without any moral bulwark, very quickly unravel into majority rule. And that tyranny of the majority is one of the central concerns running throughout his work. Part of why Ambedkar is so relevant is, on the one hand, because he thinks of minorities, he thinks of Dalits, he thinks of Muslims. He's that one thinker who constantly critiques the nationalist and the liberal position on these issues. But on the other, he's also a very planetary thinker. He is a thinker who delves into the most timeless, perhaps intractable problem of democratic rights. When, and at that point where democratic rights become democratically sanctioned tyranny of the majority, right, which we now see in several liberal democracies. Democratically elected governments using constitutional principles to normalize a regime of political cruelty. That is where Ambedkar is, in so many ways, way ahead of his time.
Okay, so that is, of course, and I noticed one thing in your work is that you always highlight that for Ambedkar, this idea of being from a minority, and you use the term minority a lot. How does this idea of the minor come out so much in Ambedkar? What does he, and how do you impute that to Ambedkar? This concept of the minor, the minority.
Right. So there are two threads running throughout his work on minorities. One is within the broader political framework of federalism, linguistic states and minorities. There are extensive studies he does on the question of what minorities what minority rights really are, on what grounds can they be forged, on what principles can they be constitutionally protected, and most importantly, what is the relationship of the minority to popular sovereignty itself? So there's that one very, very powerful element in his thought in which the minor, as I call it, the minor becomes itself only in relationship to and in resistance against sovereign power, even popular sovereignty. Ambedkar's notion of the minority, which starts developing with the Mahad Satyagraha in 1927, and it does not stop until his death in 1956. Even in the Buddha and his Dhamma, which is often described as a work of profound disappointment. Here is a thinker, we are told, that turns away from the state because he's so disappointed and then writes a book on religion. That's not accurate at all. The Buddha and his Dhamma is a profoundly democratic treatise on political rights. If you look at the attention Ambedkar gives on that one moment where Siddhartha, yet to become the Buddha, takes this anti-war position in an assembly, he's thoroughly outnumbered. If you look at the grammar and the language and the concepts Ambedkar uses to restage, almost theatrically, the resistance that the minority can wage precisely because the minority is outnumbered, is really a political reading of the democratic impasse. How does the minority become itself? A classic line from Nietzsche in the Buddha and his Dhamma, which he uses at other moments in his work, being is becoming. Right? He uses that theoretical, philosophical, or perhaps we could say anti-philosophical idea to mount this notion of the minority in relationship to sovereign power, in relationship to popular sovereignty. Why does he do that? Because popular sovereignty is distinct from democracy. For Ambedkar, democracy is a moral idea. It's a series of moral effects that stem from our moral compulsions, and these compulsions have political effects or consequences. That is what democracy is. A set of moral principles we live by, which allows us to devise a system of political rule or government. Right? In that moral universe, the minority becomes itself into sovereignty. The freedom of the minority is mounted against the majoritarian idea of popular sovereignty. So there's that one very, very crucial idea, which is a historical idea, which must be understood genealogically, but which is also a very contemporary idea, right? And to go back to that very important first question you raised about Ambedkar's, I would say, timelessness in the history of political theory as such, stems from his ability to stare at this problem so directly. So that's one crucial way in which he thinks of the minority or the minor, that which opposes the sovereign, and therefore that which will always be thoroughly outnumbered. So that's the moral idea of the minority, right? The second question of the minority comes to him partly not within the framework of government, but within the problem of social relations. And that is where he returns to the question of the political majority. And because the majority is not simply a political majority, as he says in that brilliant moment in a passage in the 1940s, as he starts writing and giving himself time to think about this question, is that the majority in India is not a political majority. This is not a majority that you can count, right? It's not a numerical majority. It's a majority that exceeds well beyond its mathematical power. within the democratic system. This is not the majority that votes for this party or that party. This is a majority that is communal. It shares, in both senses of the term communal, it shares something despite its political divisions that allows it to pitch itself as a subterranean, pernicious bulwark against minority rights. So that's the other minority that comes into existence because of the nature of India's communal majority. So these are the two ways in which, and precisely because they are so problematic to the nationalist tradition, right? Because they hold a certain almost troubling mirror to the nationalist tradition that allows that tradition to walk past Ambedkar for so long, as you were suggesting in the beginning.
Yeah, and you brought up a very interesting point that Ambedkar, like, when he's writing the Buddha and his Dhamma, people assume that at this point, the person who, in a sense, crafted India's state, who wrote the founding document, has suddenly chosen to abandon it in favor of something like religion. Now, in your work on Ambedkar, you focus a lot on this question of religion, and it is very important, this question of conversion that Ambedkar takes in public in front of, apparently, it seems like 500,000 people. Now, how does Ambedkar bring back this question of religion without falling into the traps that other thinkers of that time, like Gandhi, fell into?
Now, that's a very important, and that question has never been more relevant than in our own time. It is possibly the most foundational question because, as we now see, our foundations, democratic foundations themselves seem to be under enormous stress. And I think the question of religion is important, not only because Ambedkar converts to Buddhism, but also in some ways often described as a culmination of a political disappointment, which, as we were saying, is inaccurate. There are parts of even Annihilation of Caste, written exactly 20 years earlier, where he's already grappling with these questions, including of conversion. So let's begin with that word that you bring up, conversion, and I think it's important because that's the other word that I believe places Ambedkar within any planetary history of political philosophy or political theory. Now, if you look at the thinkers Ambedkar starts to read, what is it that he's really interested in? What is it about India? An idea that seems very abstract to him at decisive moments in his trajectory. What is it that fascinates him most about this political society, so to speak? The first is its notion that there is a religion that forms India's inheritance, and every other religion or every other community is merely let's say, to use a colloquial word, an offshoot that springs out of this particular eternal, timeless religion, right? So at some point, Buddhism springs out because some people rebel against Hinduism's orthodoxy and violence. Jainism spirals out because there are certain elements of animal sacrifice, to take one example, that some people find repulsive. Then there's the whole question of medieval conquest, where hordes of Muslim invaders from Central Asia, from what we now call the Middle East, come in, plunder the temples, and convert people. Right? There is a hyper-periodization in nationalist historiography that allows the construction of political religion as Hinduism, right? Which is to say somehow that in many ways, liberal nationalists and Savarkar are not that different in considering that the entire history of a civilization can be written as a history of a religion. Ambedkar's interest comes from this unity, underlying conceit of Indian history. How is it that a past with so many political divisions, suddenly, if you look underneath, has this crushing unity that can expel a vast swath of humanity from itself? So expulsion and conversion go together. Right? That idea is missing in nationalist accounts. In nationalist accounts of India's religious past, expulsion of humanity does not constitute a part. It's a part apart, which is left unsaid. So Ambedkar questions not, he returns to religion not so much to become religious. He returns to religion in order to understand this unity that I would still describe following a Marxian tradition, the theological political nexus. And in some ways, Ambedkar's point about Hindutva and Hinduism is proven right, precisely in the way liberals today fight the idea that Hinduism is a theology. One of the great issues of debates in Indian secularity, and we use the word liberal with some caution here, because they are not the only one, that fight the idea that Hinduism can be a theology, because Hinduism is a set of practices. Hinduism is dharma, right? Hinduism is not religion in the monotheistic sense. In philosophy of Hinduism, Ambedkar returns to this particular resistance within the nationalist tradition. And he goes for, I think he sticks his neck out deliberately, controversially, by saying that Hinduism can be a monotheism, not because monotheisms are violent, but because there is a tendency in Hinduism to become a revelation from which all ideas of political belonging and state, theocratic ideas and secular ideas of state, are derived. Right? So that's the religion he returns to, not because he is himself religious or that he becomes religious at some point, but because religion is too important for him conceptually, morally, most importantly in India, politically, to be left to Hindus. Right? And liberals are just too unaware of this underlying unity or unable to critique that underlying unity for them to leave the task of this critique of religion. Right? So one can almost, and we know this, annihilation of caste bears a very, very powerful, understated, perhaps even oblique, but very powerful resonance with Marx's writings on the Jewish question. The critique of religion is the first principle of any religious responsibility. You're not even religious if you do not have a religious critique of religion. Right? And I think that is what is so enduring and a running thread in the idea of religion. And I think one important element of your question is also the connection, the link Ambedkar sees between the critique of religion and the critique of majorities. In his work, you see this integrated thread running throughout. The idea of a political majority cannot be deconstructed unless you deconstruct the idea of a religion that is allegedly secular. So on the one hand, a secular religion that Hinduism claims to be, or Dharma claims to be, and on the other, a completely communal majority. How do these two things unite or becomes, if you will, a unity. That is where he comes to the idea of religion.
The question that the word secularism, that is something that's completely bandied about everywhere nowadays, and even if, as we see that even the right wing in India, they don't shy away from owning that word. In a sense, they also want to say we are the true secularists, because not because we believe in these western notions of secularism, but as you just said, Hinduism itself is a secular religion. It is a secular faith. Unlike, Abrahamic faiths, they use this term Abrahamic as a foil all the time. So they'll say Hinduism is by nature a secular faith, and therefore we do not need to import secular notions from elsewhere. How would and how does Ambedkar deal with this kind of secularism that is not just the preserve of the Indian liberal, but also of the Indian authoritarian or the Indian fascist or the Indian conservative?
That's an absolutely central question, and I'm glad you raised that, because that is one reason why Ambedkar keeps returning to us with ever increasing force, because in no other thinker, and I'm not what's the way to put it? I'm not making it up. There's absolutely no thinker who really deconstructs this notion of Indian secularity, so to speak. Ambedkar uses the term secular sparingly, rarely, if at all. There are descriptions of what happens in Occidental theologies, as he calls them, after a fashion of the time, where he uses the term a secular age. But for India, he is rarely ever fully committed to the idea of the secular. This is not because he believes that religion should have no place in the political and moral life of a society. Quite the contrary. There is no, as we were saying already in Annihilation of Caste, there is no way of being religious, truthfully religious, without critiquing religion. So you can be a religious person, but you cannot be so without the ability and the courage to critique that into which you are born. Right? That's where he finds the real source of human and political courage. In 1943, for example, that brilliant line, he says, "The secret of freedom is only courage." There's no big secret to freedom other than courage. Right? Now, that courage, part of that courage is a courage to face the fact that there is a power higher than us that rules us. Right? That part of being free is not simply being politically free or considering oneself to be politically free. Political freedom itself must face up to the fact that there is a higher power, a transcendent power, so to speak, from which all other authorities derive their own legitimacy. His problem with Indian secularism is that while it wants to derive this power from a transcendent notion of authority, it does not actually call it out as such. Right? It wants to make religion disappear, so to speak, in the multitude of minutiae of minor practices, 100 duties, 1,000,000 obligations, which is what explains why dharma is attached to so many things: Maryada dharma, Raj dharma, and so on, Kshatriya dharma, Shudra dharma, right? An entire constellation of religious practices are made to disappear in a society that is made into one whole around its will to punish those who transgress from that universe. Right? In that sense, Ambedkar's problem with secularism is not that it should not be secular, that our political society shouldn't be secular. It is that in a polytheistic society, precisely because religion disappears into a million fragments, so to speak, that it becomes very difficult, and it is made difficult, it is willfully made difficult to critique that religiosity. Right? To critique that religiosity is to invite punishment. Dandu Viveka. There's a punitive reason that makes the society whole. Right? And in thwarting his attempts to constitutionally and legally protect women's rights, for example, to inheritance and so on. Think of the Hindu Code Bill. Liberal and conservative nationalists prove Ambedkar's point that in the end, whether we call it punishment or penology or not, the idea that that a caste society, that Hinduism is in a sense, can live without its punitive or beyond its punitive structure is a myth. It cannot. And it cannot precisely because caste is this name for another conversion. The conversion of someone else's time into my property. Caste is a theft. It's a theft of time. Right? It's a theft of time that is used to cultivate excellence of the few on the crushing labor of the millions. Thus, the expression from millions to fractions. Millions become fractions because their time has been stolen from them, and this theft is converted into property. This theft is converted into mastery. This theft is converted into even sovereignty. Right? So that's the other conversion that Ambedkar constantly works with. And there are, and this is a very, as we know, a very rich tradition. There's a reason why Ambedkar returns to Hobbes when he writes about punishment. Right? He returns to Leviathan in order to discuss the role of punishment in caste society. He returns, as we know, to Roman jurisprudence, to ideas of civis and hostis, friend and enemy, citizen and combatant, in order to develop this idea. Because this is not an Indian problem. This is a problem for democracy. This is a problem for the human condition at large, where an entire universe of practices and rituals, which are extremely diverse, and he never discounts the fact that Hinduism is profoundly diverse, that it is capable of immense plurality. But the question is, how does this plurality then convert itself into this unitary notion of punitive power? To understand caste is to understand this first conversion first, and then return to that other conversion, because there is no other way to stage a coup against this punitive society that is organized around the will to punish.
So that's an interesting thing, because and most of us who are studying political theory or political philosophy, and if you're reading texts from the 20th century, most of these people who are writing, they are usually writing against totalitarianism. And totalitarianism is usually presumed to be the predominance of the state, predominance of a sovereign power. So, for example, there's one of the most important political texts written in the 20th century, which is Karl Schmitz's Political Theology, where his first sentence itself is, "Sovereign is he who decides on the exception." And while this seems like a very, you can say, obscure idea, it's something that is very common right now, because we are living in a time of lockdowns, where suddenly today a chief minister or prime minister can just get on stage and say, nobody can go out, nobody can do anything, you have to stay inside. So all these emergency proclamations, they are not theoretical anymore, they are lived realities, and they have always in a sense been lived realities. And a lot of people, political thinkers in the 20th century, whether they were from India or from Europe, have critiqued totalitarianism as the absolutization of sovereignty. Now, Ambedkar, in a way, does not critique totalitarianism as such. For him, what is this issue of sovereignty in Hinduism? That is not the same as a totalitarian sovereignty. It is a sovereignty of what kind? Where is the sovereign in the Hindu structure, in the caste order?
Yeah, I think that you hit upon something here which we need to be really um, giving more time to and more thought to, because in so many ways, Ambedkar's critique of sovereignty is not the critique of the kind of exceptional totalitarian sovereignty, as you were saying, but of another form of sovereignty, or rather, let's what he calls a graded sovereignty, which is to say, a sovereignty that is very acutely aware of its own topography. It's like a slope. It's I call it I would like to call it a dispositive of height. It's where everyone is above someone else while being below someone else. So that there is, as Ambedkar concedes in this idea of graded sovereignty or this structure of power, a certain kind of liberty that is available to everyone. Right? There is absolutely no one within Indian social and political order who feels absolutely subject to totalitarianism. There is no totalitarian power, which is why in the 40s, Ambedkar starts moving around or coming around the idea of tyranny. And it's a tyranny that is oblique, that is passive, that is at the same time extremely aggressive, that is on the one hand seductive because it promises a certain kind of liberty, and at the same time is oppressive because it takes time away from the multitude, so to speak, and gives it to a few. Right? So what is this system of sovereignty that Ambedkar is critiquing, which is not the kind of totalitarian sovereignty that we see thinkers in Europe or even North America critique in the 20th century? This is the kind of sovereignty that has its as its main instrument not this majestic solitary sovereign, but a form of mastery that is disseminated in everyday life because of the immense, and he says the Manusmriti is a work of genius, partly because it spreads power in an almost capillary fashion, right? In order to make subjects succumb or subordinate or surrender to its invisible dominance, right? In Ambedkar, the sovereign is not the one who decides on the exception. The sovereign is the one who decides on punishment. It is not the sovereign that comes alive during a moment of an emergency, apardharma, for example, the Schmittian idea that translates into apardharma. It is a sovereign that rules by its punitive will, which is why he makes no distinction between the kind of regimes that govern urban India from the ones that actually run wild, so to speak, in rural India. He has no such notions about the great division between the urban and the rural. He believes that cities can be cities of refuge. He believes that cities can be sanctuaries. But he has no misconception whatsoever about the idea that somehow the village, India lives in its village on the one hand, or that the city will ameliorate everything that someone suffers in the countryside. What we now see, as you were saying, is the coming together of precisely this notion of sovereignty, in which systemic neglect, and Hindutva is actually, I would say, a jurisprudence of neglect. It's a theory of power that neglects by legal will. It's built into its legal and juridical framework. So you have vast populations out of systemic neglect being pushed out into the cities. And then suddenly, out of what can only be called a systemic biopolitical violence, are then spat out on highways thousands of miles long to tread on foot back to their countryside. So what we see right now is the idea of the state, of a democratically elected state that uses its constitutional mandate to normalize a system of cruelty. In Annihilation of Caste, Ambedkar has already anticipated it. He calls it a cruel wrong. Wrong. That is to say, someone has willed this catastrophe. Someone has thought about it, about this country that eventually should, they believe, look like a penal colony. In Thoughts on Pakistan, he calls the Hindu Mahasabha and the RSS gangsterism. It's a politics that is at once punitive and kleptocratic. It will steal. It does steal. But it will steal in another name, by other names. And that's the coming together of what we see in Hindutva today, the coming together of a civilizational vision and a very modern kleptocratic gambit against democracy. We sometimes mistake, and this mistake is widespread. We mistake Hindutva of the present, as Ambedkar anticipates in revolution and counter-revolution in ancient India. We are bound to look at Hindutva in a continuity. But the Hindutva of the RSS that got banned because of violence and hatred, as a government announcement proclaimed, the Hindutva of the RSS of 1948 that was banned after Gandhi's assassination is very different from the mainstream majoritarian electoral leviathan that Hindutva today is. There are extremely important breaks. And we cannot theorize why Hindutva has become what it has become today without returning to Ambedkar, to the singular idea of the majority, which he divides into two. It's a sovereign's, it's two bodies of the sovereign. There's a political majority, right? And many vast swaths of urban liberals are not part of that political majority. Some will argue they are liberal, they are Anglophone. Even now, there are people who actually argue that somehow the BJP is a reaction against the Anglophone urban India. No, urban India fell first. It was the urban swaths of Indian population that fell first to the BJP back in the 90s and 2000s. The countryside did not. So this distinction that somehow liberals, because they vote differently, have nothing to do with the kind of majoritarian tyranny we see ourselves in the midst of, is a mistaken idea. And we cannot conceptualize, let alone grapple with the monstrosity it has become, without understanding the notion of majority that forms the heart of Ambedkar's work today.
And that's interesting because in a lot of ways, Ambedkar as a thinker and a philosopher from India has been unusually neglected by the Indian Academy, of which both of us are products and are part of. So now that has happened not just because of uh, his isolation from organizations, from intellectual movements, from the university itself, but also because, in a way, the dominant trend after independence has been decolonization and this movement called post-colonial thought. And that movement has been influenced by something that could be said to be decentralization. There is this desire to uh, move away from state power, this desire to abstract from central authorities, while Ambedkar, as in the public imagination, is the proponent of state power, of centralization in a sense. How do we deal with this facet of Ambedkar right now when state power is becoming something that is so obtrusive, that is so dangerous? How do we get the constitution back from those who have, as you said, stolen it? How do we stop the steal in that way?
Yeah, I think that brings us squarely in the realm of the present, which is for Ambedkar also always about the past and the future. And so I want to us to pause here a little bit and think about the several dimensions actually in your question. The first is which connects the discussion we are having, the earlier threads we were trying to weave. First, think of what I call a jurisprudence of neglect. Right? It seems like neglect is something passive; it is abandonment. Right? But a jurisprudence of neglect, that is to say, a neglect that is enshrined in positive law. What does that look like? That looks like our present. That looks like the classical conservative, neoconservative, and neo-fascist idea of minimum government. Right? Now, I want us to pause here precisely for this reason, because often it is argued that Ambedkar is an unequivocal champion of a very strong state. Actually, what really Ambedkar is a champion of is governmental and constitutional intervention in sites of atrocity. Right? What fascinates me about some of these kinds of critiques of Ambedkar is that these would not pass muster in a place like the United States. Right? Civil rights, voting rights, desegregation, opening of schools, these things would not have been realities, right, in the American South had not the federal government passed legislation that that compelled states, the southern states, Georgia, Alabama, and so on, to actually desegregate, to actually say that African Americans are equal citizens of an equal democracy, of an egalitarian democracy, right? What Ambedkar is arguing for well before MLK, right? Although in his capacity to call a lie, he stands next only to James Baldwin, There's that tradition which believes that it is not the unalloyed, unequivocal power of the modern state that is important. It is that a people gives itself a constitution that allows it to create a society of least injustice. Ambedkar is not a utopianist. He does not think that a society of perfect justice is possible. In fact, he says as much in 1949. He says, in effect, I'm worried that we might lose our freedom a second time. I'm worried that we are not yet even ready to keep the freedom that we have just won. And this was barely 6 years ago, right? So that notion of the state needs to be deconstructed. Under certain conditions, sovereignty is important. Popular sovereignty even is important. He's very, very clear that any wholesale denunciation or desire to liquidate sovereignty from our very consciousness is Hindutva by another name. This is when politics becomes the play of the lawless, right? An entropy of gangsterism, a tyranny of the majority. Right? He never critiques this notion of sovereignty that will allow a society to forge a path of least injustice. The Constitution as a document is the embodiment of that will, of that political will, but more importantly for Ambedkar, that moral will. That we come together and we refuse to accept an unequal world. We refuse to believe that injustice is all right. That we believe above all, and this is what he calls faith in equality, which is faith and equality. That we believe that injustice somewhere is injustice everywhere. And this prophetic tradition, which Cornel West and others track from Du Bois downwards, Eddie Glaude has now written this fabulous book on Baldwin, of which Ambedkar is a part, has never had a certain kind of, as you were saying, an institutional presence, let alone power. Even in the most powerful, formidable democratic strands of Indian thought. And the question for us is why? And that is, the example that comes to my mind is the 1980s example of the publication of Riddles of Hinduism. Right? The Maharashtra government has already almost certainly projected that the collected works of Ambedkar's writings would go over 20 volumes. This is just the fourth volume. Riddles of Hinduism is published. And the Shiv Sena, which actually cut its political teeth during the anti-trade union activities of the Congress era in Bombay. The Shiv Sena comes out, all guns blazing against that. The government of Maharashtra is forced to issue a pedantic disclaimer saying the ideas are Ambedkar's, not ours, as if that was ever in doubt, as if Ambedkar would ever win, right? But what is interesting is the liberal counter-argument. The liberal counter-argument, most of them sat out. And this, remember, is the period of Shabano, is the period of Ayodhya brimming over, is the period of the anti-Mandal agitation tacitly stoked by the Liberal Congress against affirmative action in India. The mind actually boggles. It's staggering what that kind of politics in the United States will today be called. That's not liberal. That politics of anti-Mandal, anti-minority, anti-Muslim agitation. In effect, the fiasco in Ayodhya was a fiasco because the Congress would not take the Shabana word. So this is that decade where the Shiv Sena is finally becoming political. It already is, and copies are burned and so on. But the most interesting thing was it was now targeting Ambedkar statues. So Dalit activists had to patrol certain statues. Something was burned down in Fort, right? The liberals argued that the government should not be in the business of publishing books. Right? This in a society where the largest swath of our urban liberal intelligentsia had grown up on textbooks, not only written by the most towering intellectuals of that generation, of 2 generations after independence, but actually produced and subsidized by the state. These are the liberals who now come out opposing the government of Maharashtra's attempt or project to bring out Ambedkar's works. I think it's a very interesting, the 80s are important, not only because the climactic moment comes with the demolition of the Babri Masjid in 92, but also because the institutional, the pernicious resistance against Ambedkar's critique of political Hindutva. And the time is now past when we keep calling it Hinduism. It's his critique of Hindutva, which is already germinal in works like Thoughts on Pakistan, that are taken out of that institutional context. And I think we need to more carefully pause and understand what it has done to Indian liberalism and liberal democracy.
Yeah, the word you used, a phrase that's Ambedkar's phrase, faith in equality, and you have a very long, you can say, engagement or like meditation on this phrase, faith in equality. How does Ambedkar come out as one of the most important thinkers of equality of the 20th century? What does it mean for us right now to consider equality not just as some kind of abstract uh, thing that is enshrined in constitutions, but as something that is something to be had faith in? What does it mean to have faith in equality? Because equality is not something that can be you can calculated or measured, right?
Yeah. This returns us to actually the beginning of the conversation in so many ways. The idea of equality that Ambedkar works with is not political, abstract political equality. It's most conventional, but no less ground changing or tectonic. But conventional idea of political equality is that which associates one person with one vote. And the critique of that notion of equality goes a very long way into the modern tradition. Rousseau's already asking what is this? Like, how arbitrary can this be? Right? That we believe that a person gets a number, and and then we see that coming down to the critique of human rights in people like Hannah Arendt and Ambedkar himself. Right? The notion of equality that Ambedkar works with is that which allows a certain kind of moral and political humility to emerge in a democratic society. Right? Without that humility, the humility in which, as he says in the Buddha and his Dhamma, the idea of becoming nothing, the power that comes from becoming nothing. This is not written for the minority alone. This is written also for that who finds himself or herself in a position of power. Right? Without that notion, and part of that faith is the faith in this idea of shunyata, which in Marx, there is that moment in the 1844 manuscripts where Marx says, I'm nothing because I must be everything. Right? The idea that I'm equal precisely from the ashes of this derelict, crushing servitude. That revolutionary upsurge is what, not even upsurge, which can come out as a strong word. The idea of our action, the idea of political action, makes us equal to one another. This is why tyranny works first by crushing dissent. Why does even laughter or humor offend tyrants? Because in that moment, there is something of a dissent, those facets of human equality that allow us to act like equals. There is no being equal without becoming equal, let's just say. Right? That is the spirit in which he writes, the secret of freedom is courage. But truth-telling becomes a habit. Right? Apart from these, these two things that we've referred to, the notion of cruelty, right, and the notion of tyranny, is the notion of lying in politics. Right? mendacity has become a political virtue. And I think that to Ambedkar is the third node in our inequality. One becomes equal in this courage of speaking the truth, right? Which is the spirit in which he writes, I consider my hatred to be my real force, because that is where I speak the truth from. Right? So the faith is that no matter what, we can speak this truth to power, right? Against the tyranny of the majority.
Okay, so my last question, because we have been speaking for quite a long time, and I didn't even know how fast it passed by this hour. So I just want to ask you one question. The last question is that in the review that I wrote of your work, I used this term called subcontinental philosophy. It's a neologism. It's not something that is necessarily associated with your work or with Ambedkar as such. But in a sense, I use that term because there is this necessity to create a concept for us to understand Ambedkar today, especially because the space from which we speak, which is the Indian Intellectual Academy, is something that has always closed itself off from Ambedkar. And therefore, we have to, in a way, create concepts that will allow us to not just uh, approach him, but also appreciate his contribution to philosophy. And I think one of his most important concepts, and the one that you focus a lot on, is the term maitri. Right. So could you tell us just a little bit about how you think Ambedkar develops a concept of maitri? He takes it from the Buddhist texts and develops it in his own way, and how this concept is or can be a very fundamental political or philosophical concept for us right now or for the future.
Yeah, yeah, that's a great question to end, because I think we sometimes tend to forget that quite apart from his revolutionary pessimism, Ambedkar is also a thinker of a future, of a democratic future. And while his pessimism of the intellect, so to speak, gives him this power to deconstruct India's political unraveling as he sees it and anticipates it almost prophetically in 49. There's also very strong political optimism in him, which comes from his belief in the idea of a politics, let's say, of friendship. And that politics of friendship, that politics of humility and hospitality, that politics of freedom that is not already sovereignty, that politics of rigor and truth that is not already mastery, that politics of a moral government, right? A moral self-government that is not already soaked in violence and anarchy. The problem of Ambedkar's thinking of anarchy is that he associates it not with the larger Indian population, he associates it with the state. And this returns us to that very thin line he weaves and threads through in his conception of sovereignty itself, right? How are we going to develop that politics of, let's say, freedom without absolute totalitarian sovereignty, to take the term you were using? It is through a politics of hospitality. It is a politics of maitri, even towards texts that write of someone's or my punishment. Right? At the Mahart Satyagraha, he gives a speech where he says, we have two ways to do this. We either agree to live by the precepts, the punitive laws of caste society, or we destroy the text itself. But in order to righteously destroy any text that we consider to be punitive, we first need to master it. Right? This is that other hospitality. This is that other mastery. Right? in which it is not the question of hostility between the oppressor and the oppressed. It is a question of force. It is a question of my unwillingness to surrender to power. And this unwillingness is not weakness, or as he says, it is weakness, but it is weak force. That's the other expression he uses, right? That hospitality which can, or humility, that comes from believing that democracy is not or cannot survive in a society of enmity, that democracy cannot survive in brutalism. That is what maitri is. In the Buddha and his Dhamma, where this finds its now it is interesting that through his final deck in the 50s, Ambedkar stops or begins to leave maitri untranslated in his English works. He doesn't always do that to many others. He doesn't do that to, for example, karuna, which is compassion or kindness. There are many other terms in his lexicon in the 50s. Maitri he starts to leave untranslated. And I think part of reading Ambedkar is to also appreciate this other aspect of his planetary thinking, which emphasizes a certain fidelity to the untranslatable. And maitri is in some ways a very understated node in his thinking of political hospitality, in which the majority or the minority, but especially the majority, decides, it's a majority decision, decides that hostility does not have a place, right, in a democratic world, in an equal society. And the minority, while it does not expect hospitality from the majority, it should not, because at the end of the day, this is India, and he never loses sight of that. While it should not expect that sort of unconditional hospitality, an anti-sovereign friendship from the majority, it is precisely in the power of that humility that the minority too becomes itself. That is maitri. Right? The idea that I bear no hostility to the one who oppresses me, except that I refuse to bear that hostility forcelessly. To have force is to refuse to be forceless. It's that simple, right? When he says being is becoming, to be a minor is to refuse to remain a minor. And that is in that moment of acting, of becoming, maitri creates a new politics of hospitality from both sides. But it cannot come in a society that sees its own as a seditious combatant. It cannot come in a society that looks away when a society murders its own. So maitri is not non-violence in the negative sense. Maitri is an active anti-violence, the ability to pursue a rigorous politics.
Thank you so much, Professor Kumar. This was a lovely interview. It was brilliant speaking with you. And I'm sure everyone who will be watching this will have learned a lot and will be able to go back to Ambedkar and find so much new and find so much that has, in a sense, not been excavated in the way that you did. And also to have an Ambedkar for the future, an Ambedkar that can allow us to understand not just our particular local problems, but also a universal problem, which is democracy. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Huzaifa, and thank you to the Wire as well for hosting us. It's really an honor. Thank you.
द वायर के और वीडियोस देखने के लिए सब्सक्राइब करें और बेल आइकन पर क्लिक करें। स्वतंत्र पत्रकारिता की आर्थिक मदद करने के लिए डिस्क्रिप्शन में दिए गए लिंक पर जाएं और अपनी राशि चुनें।